Welcome to Goldfish on Games, where today we're looking at the games of the publisher with a face, ImageWorks, who were formed as a sub-label to Microsoft, and as a result they had just a short life of 4 years. But in that limited time they managed to publish almost 30 titles, and few of them being all-time classics. So let's start in 1988, where they managed to release 4 games. And right from the beginning, they were releasing some quality titles. So, going in alphabetical order, we get Bamboozle. What we have here is a puzzle game, with an interesting art style that can be viewed from 2 different perspectives, with the isometric being the sort of default. But the top-down is what I believe the developer actually preferred. The goal of each level is to explode all the bombs and not die in the process. Thankfully, you are allowed to freely walk across them, with you having to actively trigger them, but once you do, you better get away as those bombs will trigger other bombs that are around them as well as destroy the ground. Now there are also some larger bombs that will have a greater area of effect, so trying to work out how to remotely trigger them is very important. And as you go there will be traps and other tricky obstacles that will show up like ice, or mines that will detonate as soon as you step on them. Ferdinandez must die. A vertical scrolling shooter in the vein of Commando, but one where we start in a jeep and we get to drive around shooting at the various soldiers and emplacements, with guns and cannons, even if trying to direct that gun is a little bit of a pain. Now the number of enemies on screen is impressive, but it does feel like they aren't actually all that bothered, as quite often they'll just wander off. And the baddies, well, they'll just also keep on spawning and just wander around aimlessly, with occasionally shooting at you, or in any random direction. To the extent that I actually found it easier to avoid them most of the time than trying to take them out. And as you go along, you might want to blow open some of the doors to the buildings, as you might get bonuses or might find one of their leaders to take out, or even some hostages that are mostly about extra points. It's colourful with decent enough art for the time, but is really not the best example of this type of game. Sky Chase. Bit of a forgotten early title from Maxis. Yes, that Maxis. This is a wireframe flight sim that's all about the combat, as it's always one-on-one fights, with the screen always being presented with 2 views. To start the game, you can pick your aircraft from a decent enough list that also includes a paper airplane, and then we start off with the planes facing each other and then the chase is on. Now if you're playing against the computer, you can just pull a 180, launch a missile and you'll win 90% of the time. But if you do let them fly off first, then it will end up being a bit more of an entertaining game as you try and hunt them down. Now it plays well enough for the time, with nicely drawn 3D graphics, but if you go into this one expecting a detailed flight sim, you're going to be a little bit disappointed. But if you want a multiplayer game, then you're gonna get some fun out of it. Speedball. An absolute all-time classic by the Bitmap brothers. And while its sequel is the one that people will go on about, you can see its roots here, with their graphical flair that the company would be known for already on show. Now there are a number of modes that you can play from knockouts to leagues to multiplayer, which might seem all very similar, but once we get into the game proper, you'll start to spot the differences between them, as the width of the pitch is the same as the screen. And really the only way of scoring in this futuristic sport is to throw the ball into the goal. Now getting to the goal will involve passing between your team members and punching the opposition. It's still fast, with all the brutal action we'd come to expect, but just in a slightly more compact form, and missing some of the bells and whistles that we'll see in the later games. But we still do get some fun things like picking up credits and then trying to bribe the officials to let us through anyway. And while you might be tempted to jump straight to Speedball 2, give this one a go, as I think it's interesting enough in its own right. In 1989 in many ways was more of the same, as they put out 5 games, but they quickly latched onto the arcade ports, which they're going to use to really boost their numbers going forwards. Blasteroids. This one was by Teak Software, and it's a port of the arcade game. Now this was the third of the Asteroid titles, and it was the one that moved away from vectors to using bitmap graphics with more detailed looking rocks, backgrounds and ships, which is somewhat recreated in this port, if a little cut down from the arcade. Now with later games like Stardust, we would know the Amiga could do so much better, but this was still early on in its life. Now one of the cool things about this game is that you have multiple ships with their own strengths and weaknesses that you can switch between at any time by pressing back on the joystick. There are also upgrades that you can find as you go along, mostly by taking out the UFOs. Now it has some interesting touches like the different asteroid types, or those stations that show up to take you to the next level. But the sound effects are a little weak, as it sounds like the most basic pistol that you've ever found, and there's only just a single music track. Blood Witch. A dungeon crawler that allows for 1 or 2 players to simultaneously play, and the screen is really designed around this, so even in single player you'll only get a small bit of the screen in the middle, but in the 2-player mode then you'll get a split screen view that you can use. The basics are quite standard for the time, with the movement being shown in 3D, but you moving in whole squares when you use the controls down the side of the screen. Now as you travel around you can talk to various characters that might give you hints of what's going on, or you might even recruit them into your party, which is a really cool touch. Now this is a huge game to explore, so you might want to try and make a map as you go, just so you don't get lost. As while the graphics do look great for the time, a lot of the dungeon does look the same. Just remember to explore absolutely everywhere, as you'll need to find those keys to be able to open up the doors. There was also an expansion, the Extended Levels, that was also released this year. Passing Shot. Another arcade conversion, also by Teak, and they seem to be the go-to company for these. Now this was a Sega title that they've brought over to the Amiga, and it's a tennis game with a bunch of speech samples and music. Now each game seems to be the final match point, and can be played solo or in doubles, and it uses this twin view for the gameplay. You get a behind the view when you serve, and then it goes top down for the rallies, with the ball having this nice scaling effect when it's heading up towards us. But the basic movement of the players is a little slow, and trying to hit those shots is not easy. And you also have no idea where your player is when they aren't on screen, so it makes trying to judge where you're going to need to be to hit the ball back extremely difficult. It also doesn't help that trying to judge the height of the ball isn't particularly easy either. Phobia, a horizontal shooter from the developer of Bomboozle, Captain Planet and Captive, and it's doing some fancy tricks with the background, isn't it? But that hides a bit of a tricky shooter, as there's lots of objects that will come flying at you, and some will leave behind lines that you'll also need to shoot if you want to avoid dying. Now there are upgrades that you can get, but outside of grabbing those capsules, the upgrades are out of your control. So it'll start off with you getting a slightly stronger firepower, to then getting a second one that will angle down. Now the game is pretty unclear on what it is you need to do, as you might play and then end up hitting a barrier and then just dying. Now this is because you'll need to take out those little shield icons first, and then you can take on the boss. And then eventually you'll get to then kill the planet. And with all that done, you can then use the map to try and select where you want to go to next. But you might see a flashing icon on the moons, and if you go to that and complete it, then you might get a drone. But with everything else in this game, it's not really clear what it is you need to do to get the drone, or what they will even help you with. Xenon 2 Mega Blast. Love it or hate it, this is one of the Bitmap Brothers' most famous titles, and I fall into the love it category, even if I've never been all that good at it. It has a great art style with lots of interesting baddies to shoot at in this vertical shooter, even if it does chug at times. And yes, I might be cheating a little and using a joystick with autofire. That was my preference back in the day, and it still is now. Even if the game does give you an autofire power up near the beginning, it's not enough. But the upgrades do arrive quick, and there are some interesting ones like the backshot or the side attacks. There is also a money system with the baddies dropping these small and large bubbles that you can then spend in the shop. Now that's where the real upgrades come from, with all sorts of things that you can attach to the side of the Mega Blaster. Or you can just go all out and get the limited Super Nashua power up. That's always fun. And then we've got to mention the music, with it being a remixed version of the Bomb the Bass track. It's a stunning game in my opinion that might put style over substance, with some nasty dead ends that you'll have to deal with. 1990 is a year of extremes, as they managed to put out 9 titles. But they also started to get a little bit experimental. Back to the Future 2. This was developed by Images, and it was ImageWorks' first step into the movie licensed world, And even though they tried to follow the style of the time, which was to try and recreate the movie using different gameplay styles, what we got did not leave a good first impression after the intro, as this was a bad game, where we get this hoverboard section that really is not great to play, with enemies that are best avoided, as otherwise you're going to get taken out by the cars, and the only real impressive bit of this entire section is when it changes direction. Now the other major gameplay style is when you have to sneak Jennifer out of the house, where you're going to have to try and avoid the other family members and open and close doors, but it's just a bit of a confusing mess. Now somehow they managed to get this one included with an A500 bundle, and out of all the games they released, this might be one of their worst. Cadaver. The Bitmap brothers are back again, and they're trying another different genre, and this time it's an isometric adventure game, where we've been dumped into this land and we'll need to explore, pick up items, as well as fight against various creatures. Although I will say the combat doesn't have as much feedback as I'd like. You can be throwing stones at an enemy and have no idea if you're actually hitting it or not, until it either explodes or it just continues trying to fight you. Now the whole game is full of that bitmap look and feel, with a very distinct art style, which brings you into the world and makes you want to solve the various puzzles and mysteries and try and work out where it is that you need to go. Now do pay attention to the lower sides of the screen, as sometimes the exits aren't always obvious and are slightly hidden down here. Now there was also an expansion pack called The Payoff, that was published by Renegade rather than ImageWorks. Flip It and Mangoose, water carriers from Mars. Now this long-winded name comes from Expanding Minds, and it's a platformer that's really designed for simultaneous multiplayer, as there will always be a split screen with the other player being played by the computer if you're trying to do this in single player. Now the goal is to try and collect water and take it back to your ship. But to do that, you're going to need to solve some mini puzzles, which will involve collecting items and then trying to place them on the right platform. For example, these are nutcrackers. Yes, they are meant to be nutcrackers, not just pliers, and these need to be given to the gorilla. But you can only do it on this square, and if you do that, it'll make them happy enough that they'll give you a bug. It won't stop them from attacking you with those nuts that send you flying around the screen and are extremely annoying, but you can then give the bugs to the frogs, who will then spit out some water that you're going to have to be very quick to try and collect in your collector. Oh, you did pick that up, right? It's odd, the game looks nice enough, but it does get very busy, and it is just actually a little bit annoying to play. Gravity. A game from Ross Goodley. Now this is a complex one, as it might appear on screen. Now you'll have a direct control over some of your ships, and you'll want to go out and try and make lots of money, as that will let you buy more upgrades as well as more ships. Now typically the first thing you'll be asked to do is try and form a new colony, which will be highlighted on the map. And as you move around this world that is pretty much in 3D, even if it is given an isometric style, you're going to want to use the black holes to try and take you to the other systems. But if all of this wasn't complicated enough, there's an entire programming language that you can use to program the other ships so they can go out and do their own things. Or you can go and use your drones to help you out in battle. There is so much to this game, so it's a bit of a shame it's so incredibly dense and hard to get to grips with. And I think it's because of this ended up being one of the cover disc games for Amiga format. Interphase. A complex 3D game by the assembly line. Now we play as Chad, a hacker, who's trying to help Cafe to steal some music. Which means dealing with the security system of this extremely tall building. Now most of our movement is done in this 3D hacker world, all while we have to think about where Cafe is in their 2D map, and what is currently blocking her. Now she will drop messages to give you an idea, like this door is locked, so we're going to need to try and find where that is and shoot it to fix the situation. But there's all sorts of traps and tricks to deal with, and enemies flying around in cyberspace. They're all trying to attack you and stop you from getting where you need to go. Now everything in the game also seems to happen in some form of real time, so you're going to have to do things in the right order, quickly, if you want to get Cafe to where she's trying to get to. Now it is a very fancy looking game with this full 3D world, but it's possibly one for the more later, more powerful Amigas. Omicron Conspiracy. A First Star Software developed sci-fi adventure game that has its own style of interaction, with you directly moving the character around, either by pushing them with the mouse or using the joystick. You can then bring up a list of actions that you want to do when you're next to the item in question. But you are limited with how many objects you can hold in your inventory. There's no magic jacket here that can contain a ladder as well as a dog. And right from the very beginning, you're expected to take some notes, such as the coordinates of where you're meant to be going for your mission, as we're going to have to travel around the galaxy in the Falcon to solve the mystery and complete the story, all with our floating robot drones here to help us, as we're going to have to track down information on a drug ring, and as our first port of call we're going to have to go to Kron. Now, this game isn't a looker, but I do think there's an interesting title here. Speedball 2 Brutal Deluxe. Another stone cold classic from the Bitmap brothers, and the last game that they would get published by ImageWorks, as after this they would set up their own publisher, Renegade, as by all regards they weren't particularly happy with how things were going with the publisher. But all that didn't stop them releasing one of the future sport titles that every other one is measured against. They've all tried to beat this, including later versions of Speedball, but none have come close. As you're going to have to take your team, the Brutal Deluxe, and take them to the top, in a pitch that's now much larger than before, with new items down the side including loops, stars and teleporters, that might give you some quick points or act as a multiplier. The action is more brutal than ever. Ice cream! Ice cream! where just winning isn't enough. You're going to want to collect the coins so you can then upgrade your team, or you can go and have some fun in the fast-paced multiplayer.
Get ready!
Teenage Mutant Ninja and Hero Turtles. Developed by Daisy Soft and Probe Software, this is a bit of an odd one, as it had been released in the US as the Ninja Turtles, but they were given an extra 3 months of development when it came over to Europe, and that gave it enough time for it to be given a bit of an upgrade that not only matched the cartoon more, but also reduced the 3 discs down to just a single one. But it was still the same game that launched on the NES, and it still has some of the same issues that that game had, with a few new ones added in, such as the scrolling and the controls. Now Hero also has a big issue on the A600, as you need to press the return key on the keypad to enter the party wagon. Whoops! Now outside of that, you'll find a decent sized game here, with you exploring buildings in the side-scrolling beat-em-up style, and then moving around the overworld trying to find the path forward, all while having to deal with a very interesting set of characters. And oh yeah, the underwater swimming bit, that's still here. Theme Park Mysteries, variations on a theme. An adventure game by Joined Up Writing Software, this is another odd one, as it has hints of being a point-and-click adventure, but it's also action-based, as you move the main character around with the joystick, but then interact with the world using the mouse. Now it is possible to softlock yourself right at the start as you need tokens, which you'll find in the pachinko machine, but you can also then play it to try and get more tokens, or you can lose them all and then you can't get any further, as you'll need to buy a pass from the Zoltan machine, which will open up the other areas of the game, where you'll also need to decide how long you want to dream, as these are dream worlds that you're going into, and that is where the majority of the game takes place. Now there are various different gameplay styles in the different dreams, from side-scrolling platforming that has a hint of gods, to top-down puzzling. There's even a 3D style racer. As I said, it's a bit of an odd one. "1991 was their biggest year, with 10 titles released, but they also had their biggest swings between their highs and their lows. Back to the Future Part 3. Now after the disaster of Part 2, Probe were brought in for this one, a studio that could do amazing as well as awful things, and this one is not one of their best. You start off trying to avoid the items being thrown from the wagon, while you also try to avoid stuff that's on the ground. Now every so often, you'll also need to shoot either forward or backwards to knock things out of the air. Now if you get far enough, it will switch to a top-down view that requires the Doc Brown to shoot at people, which I don't recall him doing in the film. Now the saving grace is it seems that you have unlimited lives to try and finish this. And if you manage to finish that, or if you have one of the versions that lets you practice one of the other levels, you might find a Duck Hunt style minigame that is a sort of first person thing where you try and aim the gun, or you give the pie throwing a go, where you have to try and throw the pies at the gang, in this difficult to control section. that will also time out quite quickly. Blade Warrior. An early game by Jason Kingsley, who would go on to form Rebellion Developments. A very stylistic looking game from the start, with this great silhouetted look. Now at the beginning it might feel a little looks over gameplay, as the basic combat, well, it feels basic. And for a while I wasn't even sure if I was being hit or doing any hitting. But if I moved closer, then I started to notice the blood effects. And if you're wondering about your health, as I was, it's the moon. Now there's doors that you can enter and potions that you can find, and then a whole inventory system that hints at far more to this game. There's also a map that shows you how many places you will visit as you go through the game. But you might also get a blood moon, where you'll have to fight against a much larger monster. This is a bit of an interesting, if slightly odd title, that I think could be hiding something really interesting. Or this sort of combat might be all there is. Brat.
Yes, Mummy? No way, man!
A force field game that kicks off with a nicely animated intro that makes way for a bit of an interesting puzzle game, where you have to guide the brat around these isometric levels where you can place arrows on the ground to change the direction the kid is walking. But to make things harder, you're sort of up against the clock as the level will start to scroll on its own. And if you end up falling behind, well, as you can imagine, it's a life lost. You can also fall off the edges, which is another life lost. The game is tricky right from the start, as you'll be presented with items that you can use, like the dynamite that you can place to blow up some of the rocks. But there's other items that you might need to use to build bridges or stop traps from happening. It's an interesting idea and presented well, but I think the force progression really takes away from this title. But it has made me extremely interested in checking this out more. Devious Designs. A game with a serious intro. What turns out to be, well, it's another puzzle game. But this time the main goal is to move the blocks around to complete the shape outlined. Now this is done by moving our tiny character around and picking up the objects, which can then be thrown, dropped or pushed around. All while some sorts of random things show up to mostly hide the level and just get in the way. Now there are the odd power-ups and icons that you can collect. Now the first few levels do a great job of introducing you to the basics, even if they do take longer to load than they do to complete. Now this is another game that really could have done without the timer, but I do think this is a lovely looking title, and one that I had no idea existed until I played it for this video, so it's going to be one that I'll have to check out. The First Samurai. Vivid Image are the masterminds behind this legendary game. And after the awesome intro, we get into the game proper. That is a bit of a cross between a side-scrolling beat-em-up, Ninja Gaiden, and Metroid, as we have these huge levels that you'll need to explore, all while having to punch, kick, slice, and attack the various enemies that will try and get in your way. But you're also going to need to track down items, in particular the bells, as they can summon genies that can trigger some form of action that will allow you to progress, such as creating rain to put out some fire. Now the movement and combat can be a bit slow, but I do think it works really well with the single button control system. Now you'll also find pots dotted around this absolutely huge map, and they act as respawn points if you can put some of your energy into them. And you'll also find these potions that can teleport you back to them, which can be really handy with some of the dead-end tunnels that you'll come across. Now this is an absolutely stunning game that can start off a little confusing due to how vast it is. The Killing Cloud by Vector Graphics, where we're in the far-off future of 1997, where the Killing Cloud, a form of smog, has ravaged the population. Now we need a special police force with flying ships to take on the criminals that are left of San Francisco, in a game that was clearly inspired by Wing Commander, as we're given these missions that you'll need to pay attention to, as they'll tell you the areas that you need to go to. And before you can go take off, you're going to need to deploy items like nets and the catch wagons that will be required. Eventually you can jump into your craft and take to the streets, or well, the skies, at least to start with. And once you've worked out the keys, as this has taken some cues from some various flight sims, as you'll need to start your engines, you can go off and fly above and below the cloud, as you try and track down and stop the various targets, and you might even need to get out on foot to finish it off. Megalomania. Sensible Software's strategy classic, and the only game they had that was published by ImageWorks. Now this has all the hallmarks of a sensible game, from the great graphics and presentation to the tiny people that you're going to have to guide to expand and research new weapons, as well as raise them up through the levels as you are at war with other deities and their people. Judging how many people to dedicate to research and collecting resources is important, as you also want your population to increase, with later maps requiring you to expand out to new areas that will require their own set of people. With all of this taking place in real time, with the more people you can give to a task, the quicker it will be solved. As you'll also want to move up through the various eons, as you start to get more impressive and more powerful weapons as you go. And you get all of this with some nice detailed graphics, some great sound effects, in a wonderful title. Predator 2. This was from Arc Development, and it continues ImageWorks' poor choice of licenses, or at least possibly going with the wrong team or not giving them enough time, as here we get an on-rails shooter, with our main character being shown in an outline, which is actually quite unique. In a move that was quite standard for the Amiga, you could only choose between music or sound effects, but here with just the music, it really made you feel disconnected from what was going on in the game. I never really had that problem with other titles, but here, because you're meant to be shooting all the time, it just feels wrong. The game also just continues to move, with enemies showing up from just about everywhere, with the odd civvy that you'll also need to avoid. Now it could have done with moments where it stops and had set pieces or something to try and break the game up, as we don't even have a secondary fire. The whole thing just feels a bit half-baked. Robozone. Also from Arc Developments, this is another one that starts off with an extremely fancy intro. But what we get is effectively a platformer, in which we're moving around in a large mech, and we're having to make our way through these tunnels, that you'll want to do as quickly as possible, as the pollution meter is effectively time, and it continues from one level to the next. Now there are various weapons and energy upgrades that you can find along this very long and confusing maze, that you'll have to jump up and down through the various holes to continue. And if you manage to finish this level, then you'll end up doing the same, but this time it's in a 3D view, with it being behind the Wolverine tank. But you'll still need to do the same thing of walking around the streets, moving into the side streets, and having to hold back to turn around when you get stuck. All while just trying to work out how to get to the exit. Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles: The Coin Up. A probe conversion of the legendary arcade classic. Now this port can be best called serviceable. Now if you had absolutely nothing else that you could enjoy it on, then this isn't too bad, even if it is a little slow. But it doesn't look quite as good as you think it should, and it's also limited to 2 players only. And on top of all of that, it's also limited by its single button controls. But you can see the arcade original in this, as you can punch, kick and use your weapons to clear out the Foot Clan, as you try and progress further into these scrolling beat 'em up levels. But enjoyment is a bit limited due to the lack of music and very basic sound effects. 1992 was the last year for this publisher, because of their parent company going bankrupt and bringing them down with them, and as a result they only had a single title they managed to release: Cisco Heat. A final arcade conversion, this time by ICE. This is a racing game based on the Jaleco coin-up, where it's the police's turn to race around San Francisco. Now this is presented in that classic Outrun Lotus style, and for the most part runs actually quite nicely, as you'll have to deal with curves and hills, so many hills, that can even make you go flying. Now you'd think they'd try and clear the streets for this race, but nope, it's full of trucks and stuff that you'll have to deal with. Now the party piece of this game is the 90-degree turns that you'll have to make every so often, which aren't too difficult, and they do add a little to the game as you're racing along. Now unsurprisingly, based on where it came from, this is a timed arcade racing game, where you'll need to make it to the end of the track, before the time runs out, but you're also racing against the other cars. And there we have it, an interesting publisher that, due to external events, ended up closing sooner than they expected. And there were quite a lot of games here that I had played and enjoyed back in the day, with more than a few of them ending up in some of the big budget box sets like the one I got with my Amiga, or ended up being given away for free on some of the magazines. Now, as always, let me know which of these that you played and which one was your favourite, and if there's any other publishers that you want me to cover. And before I go, I'd like to thank my amazing Patreons who help me in so many ways, and in return they get to see these videos advert free a whole week early, as well as getting to see their name on the screen. And if you'd like to join them, you can do so for free, links will be in the description. So until next time, I was the Goldfish, that made me hungry for some
Ice cream! Ice cream!
and this was Goldfish on Games.